When I think of a Souls-like game, I think of a long and harrowing journey with a clear start and a clear end. And when you look back, you take a moment to remember the path travelled, the battles you've fought and overcome, the missteps you've taken and everything in between. In the past, we've seen classic genre-defining games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring. We've seen innovative spin-offs like the action-based Nioh series and unique twists like Hollow Knight. Lords of the Fallen is a new Souls-like developed by Hexworks as their debut game, reigniting the series from a somewhat failed attempt in 2014. The original Lords of the Fallen received mixed reviews, so let's see if the new Lords of the Fallen 2023 can reinvigorate the series. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at Lords of the Fallen. In this video we'll play through and dissect every single mechanic, every boss and every area. We'll take a look at the game's good bits and its bad bits to answer the simple question: is it good? As with most Souls-like games, we begin by making our character. In Lords of the Fallen you'll be faced with a choice of classes, ranging from spellcasters, melee warriors and characters that excel in ranged. Your choice of class won't matter too much overall, and really it just dictates the starting gear and base stats of your character, so don't worry about it too much early on. There are also some classes that can only be unlocked via gameplay, these being the Dark Crusader, the Lord, the Putrid Child and the Radiant Purifier. The character creation menu offers you the ability to change your character's appearance, as you would expect, but honestly you'll never see your face anyway, so just do whatever feels best. We select the Partisan because who doesn't love a flail? We name our character and we get going.
Lo, the latest receiver of his grace. Great potential dwells within you, doubtless, for you to be chosen thusly. And so does Aureus' wisdom guide my hand in the bestowment of this subsequent boon. Your flesh has been made sacrosanct with the mark of the Dark Crusaders. Prove yourself worthy of this gift. Seek me in the bowels of the bridge. Our work is of the greatest import.
Our journey kicks off in the bleak, gloomy confines of the Defiled Sepulchre, and in traditional Souls-like fashion we arise from the dead. If you've ever played a Dark Souls game in the past, you'll know exactly what to expect in the early stages. A few surprises, some tutorials and weaker enemies to teach you the basics. As we progress, we learn the basic controls: rolling, dodging and attacking enemies. In Lords of the Fallen we can dodge by pressing the circle button if you're using a controller. If you're not using a controller, then throw that keyboard in the bin and buy a controller, because this game is literally impossible without it. The dodge mechanic is pretty interesting and offers different options depending on the input. If you press it once, you'll do a quick sidestep. Pressing it twice makes you do a full-on roll. The quick step is actually pretty cool, and it feels pretty good to use it in combat to sidestep and dance around your enemy. It makes the gameplay feel fluid. We'll get our teeth into some of the more advanced mechanics later, so don't worry, because Lords of the Fallen has some of its own unique tricks up its sleeve. We encounter our very first enemy, who doesn't pose much of a threat and we kill him with ease, and he drops experience in the form of Vigor, or Souls for the veteran of the genre. After getting to grips with the basics and fighting a few enemies, we arrive in an expansive area and get a glimpse of the sky above, the sunlight shining down onto the decrepit, ruined area, and we spot a big bronze door nearby. As we approach, we get a message which informs us about umbral moths. Lords of the Fallen utilises the tried and true approach of a Souls-like game, but adds its own unique twists along the way. One of these twists involves the use of the umbral lamp, which we can use to manipulate the umbral realm, the alternate dimension. Every location in Lords of the Fallen exists in two dimensions at once. You've got the real world Axiom, and the umbral realm which exists as a separate layer over the top, almost like the Upside Down from Stranger Things. As we shine our lantern, which acts as an offhand weapon, we can reveal the umbral realm intertwined around us. Pressing the square button allows us to traverse into the umbral realm fully, allowing us to navigate the realm without the use of the lantern, but leaving the real world behind. This is such a great mechanic, and Lords of the Fallen really leads into this throughout the whole game. There are areas that you'll miss entirely if you're not in the umbral realm, and the whole game seamlessly intertwines around two dimensions at once, and it's a really impressive feat. There are even enemies that will only exist in the umbral realm, and shining your lantern on them will reveal them in all of their glory. But be careful, because if you get hit by an enemy with your lantern out, you'll be forcefully transported into the umbral realm to fight them. The umbral realm also has different mechanics for fighting too. Umbral enemies will deliver withered damage, which adds a grey outline to your health bar. Being attacked by real-world enemies causes you to lose all of your withered health. Attacking enemies grants you a portion of your withered health back to you, so sort of like in Bloodborne when you retaliate to regenerate your health. There are also some more mechanics relating to the umbral realm, but we'll explore those later on. We continue onward, fighting some fairly basic enemies to warm up our skills, and the game gives us another pop-up explaining the health mechanic. Healing works very similar to other Souls-like games. You have an item called the Sanguinarix, which allows us to heal. Think of it as an Estus flask from Dark Souls. You'll only get a small number of uses of this item early on, so be sparing with your healing usage. Later down the line you'll get the opportunity to upgrade the Sanguinarix for more uses, but for now we're stuck with 3 charges. The game then prompts us to use the lantern again, but this time to enter the Umbral realm fully. We press the square button and get whisked away into the Umbral. The world warps around us, and now we can see the true expanse unfold right before our eyes. I love the look of the Umbral realm. The use of the Lovecraftian cosmic horror aesthetic really works well here. When you're inside the Umbral realm, you can only escape by finding an Umbral effigy, or by resting at a vestige, which we'll get back to soon. It's also worth noting that you effectively have 2 lives when playing Lords of the Fallen. If you die in the Axiom realm, you'll be transported into the Umbral realm for a second chance. Dying in the Umbral realm means permanent death. Navigating the world inside the Umbral realm is always a risk, because you'll be chased by an endless onslaught of Umbral enemies, ranging from zombies to the mysterious Womb of Despair enemy, which is just straight out of my nightmares. Traversing into the Umbral realm, we're finally able to navigate over the gap that we couldn't in the real world, leading us to the area where the tendrils are connected. This is where the game teaches us how to use the Soul Flay mechanic. By pressing the right trigger with the lantern poised, our character will perform a Soul Flay attack, which pulls the soul right out of anything standing in front of you. You can even use this in combat to pull enemies' souls right out of their bodies, which is awesome. And you can also use it on select spots in the world to activate cutscenes, open doors, or trigger other effects. In our case, using the Soul Flay on the statue causes the Umbral tendril to disappear, which unlocks a door for us. This whole section is effectively a large tutorial for the game's mechanics, and it works well. The way the player is taught how to play the game is immersive. We then encounter an emergency effigy, which allows us to return back to the normal realm, although be careful, these effigies can only be used once per life, so if you return to the Umbral realm again, these effigies won't be available when you do, so try not to get stuck in the Umbral realm. Opening the door, we arrive in the abandoned Red Copse, effectively Lords of the Fallen's very first area, and I've gotta say, this place looks wonderfully atmospheric with the misty, washed out colours and muddy greys and greens which highlight the atmosphere of the game perfectly. So far, I'm impressed with how Lords of the Fallen looks, feels and plays. Here we encounter our first vestige. The game tells us that these are locations in which previous lamp bearers like ourselves died. Vestiges are the bonfires of Lords of the Fallen and act as a permanent respawn point when you're killed. If you've ever played a Soulslike game before, you'll be familiar with the concept, and Lords of the Fallen carries on the tradition well. Gameplay is progressive, and the player's goal is to progress slowly through the game by activating more and more of these vestiges as you go. The game does have some unique mechanics linked to these vestiges, which we'll get back to later on. We continue our way down the misty, muddy path and come face to face with our first boss. What would a Souls-like game be without a tutorial boss? Here, we face the Holy Bulwark Otto, a giant mace-wielding knight. Honestly, this guy is a pushover, and shouldn't present a challenge to anyone but the most inexperienced lamp bearers. This is also where the game teaches us about blocking and parrying. Using L1 on a controller allows you to hold up your weapon or shield to block an enemy's attack. Parrying is a contentious topic in the community in Lords of the Fallen, although it works similarly to other Souls-like games. Time your block exactly when an enemy attacks and you'll do a parry, and you'll be rewarded with a nice pinging sound. Although parrying doesn't open an enemy up to a strong attack like in most Souls-like games, but it does reduce the amount of withered damage you take compared to blocking normally, and it also reduces the enemy's posture slightly. If you deplete an enemy's posture fully, it allows you to do a grievous strike, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It has to be said though, parrying feels lackluster in Lords of the Fallen, because you don't feel adequately rewarded for doing so. Nothing really happens unless you manage to pull off multiple parries to break an enemy's posture, which is a shame. With our newfound abilities of parrying and blocking, the Holy Bulwark Otto goes down with ease. Was that it?
Give me that lamp.
This wonderful fellow is the Light Reaper, and technically marks the first real boss encounter in the game, but don't get your hopes up on beating him. You'll probably meet the Grim Reaper before beating this guy. Oh wait, no, that happens later.
John C.
If you get killed by him the first time you see him, like I did, he'll pop up in specific locations throughout the game. Kind of like in Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin, when they added about 12 million pursuer fights across the game. That was a good idea, wasn't it? If you are some sort of gaming deity and manage to kick his ass the first time, he won't come back again, which is pretty cool. However, you'll eventually be required to face your recurring nightmare, because at the end of the game you'll face him as a mandatory respawning boss. The Light Reaper and his lovely pet dragon roast me faster than a marshmallow on a campfire and sail off into the sunset. We find ourselves back at the previous vestige, and I was immediately dreading how long I'd be stuck here, trying to fight this guy again. It reminds me of that tutorial fight from Dark Souls 3. That guy literally stopped me from playing the game for about 3 hours. Good times. Thankfully though, the Light Reaper decides not to waste his time with us, and we continue onward. We go down a rocky path and we're introduced to the Umbral Parasite mechanic, another addition to the Lantern and the Umbral realm. An enemy with a snazzy blue health bar indicates that they've got an Umbral Parasite attached to them. Maybe they should see a doctor about that. Umbral Parasites cause an enemy to heal really quickly, and in some cases they won't take any damage at all. You can hold up the lantern with the R1 button and siphon the parasite, which smashes it. Once you've burst the parasite, the enemy returns to normal and can be killed. Simple. Brace yourselves though, because later on we'll see some interesting twists to this mechanic and some pretty infuriating moments revolving around these Umbral shenanigans, and I'll point them out as we go. Shortly afterwards, we encounter a hole in the road. Illuminating the area with our lantern reveals a Soulflake statue, which we can use to cross the gap, but the problem is we can only do this in the Umbral realm itself. This is a use of the Umbral realm mechanic that we'll see time and time again in Lords of the Fallen, an example of a situation that requires us to be in the Umbral realm to progress. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the fact that we're given the freedom to swap between realms at will, but in this instance, like many other locations in the game, we get forced to hop into the Umbral realm to progress. The game uses this as almost a mechanism to increase the difficulty by throwing Umbral enemies at you. It feels less like a choice and more of a forced artificial difficulty curve. After getting top marks on the gap challenge, we encounter our first friendly face, the Iron Wayfarer. As is tradition in all Souls-like games, this character serves up a healthy dose of absolutely incomprehensible gibberish. He also saves some of his dialogue until you chat to him multiple times. So, unless you want to miss stuff, make sure you talk to all NPCs until they start repeating themselves. Imagine you had to have a conversation like that with everyone in real life. In Lords of the Fallen, most NPCs come with their own quest lines to follow, but the game won't hold your hand when it comes to tracking your progress, or even telling you what you're supposed to do. Most of these quests involve tasks like collecting specific items, exhausting their conversations, and summoning them for specific boss encounters, and we'll talk more about boss summons later on. I didn't really interact with any of these NPC quests much in my playthrough because they're about as clear as mud. If you fail an NPC quest by not summoning them for a specific fight, or missing an objective, they'll just disappear from existence and you'll never see them again. It's like an elaborate puzzle, but when you mess up, the pieces just disappear forever. If you are planning to complete all of these quests, and you'll need to for specific items and achievements, then buckle up for some serious strategic planning and multiple New Game Plus runs. Continuing onward, we enter Redcope's village, and this is an early game area where the difficulty starts to ramp up a bit. This wonderful forest village has an assortment of lovable foes, including melee swordsmen, spell-slinging hunchbacks, and if you're in the Umbral realm, some extra undead buddies for good measure. So far, I'm enjoying myself. It's like Elden Ring, but with some fresh new Umbral mechanics. The early game is pretty well designed with interesting locations and good enemy design. It's just a matter of learning their patterns and slowly making progress. The issue with enemy variety and the problem of sheer enemy density won't rear their heads until later on. For now, we finally managed to mow down enough enemies and arrive at a big tree that looks like the Whomping Willow from Harry Potter. Anyone else, or is that just me? If you look up, you'll notice a dead man hanging from a tree, not having a really good day. This is where the game uses its chance to teach us about ranged combat. Ranged combat in Lords of the Fallen acts slightly differently to what you might expect. There are numerous ranged combat styles that you can choose from, including crossbows and different ammo types, spears and throwing weapons. When you use a ranged item, you'll deplete your ammo meter, shown here in the top left. When it's empty, you'll need to use an ammunition replenishing item, or rest at a vestige to recover. There's a variety of ranged combat items, and these allow you to pick different playing styles depending on your preference. Some of these items offer status effects like bleeds, and can even heal you. Some character builds focus more on range mechanics than others, so if you want to be a full-on range build, it's entirely possible. After mastering the mechanics of ranged combat, we knock down the poor dead man and get rewarded with an item for our troubles. A good reinforcement of learned mechanics. We're free to explore the village once more, and it's worth doing so. While there aren't any earth-shattering rewards here, exploration is always handsomely rewarded, which I like to see. After a bit more wandering, we encounter a tough enemy, the Calrath Knight. When I first came across this hulking menace, I did have a bit of a panic because just look at him. But don't worry, because we'll be seeing a lot more of these guys across the whole game. He's got a ton of health and he hits like a truck, and he has a few ranged abilities to top it off. Every now and then he'll summon fiery nails which litter the ground and damage you on collision. And when he's feeling saucy, he'll pelt you with tiny little fireballs, and this attack lasts for a ridiculously long time. Honestly, it's good dodging practice. Normally, if you die, your souls, or your vigor as Lords of the Fallen calls it, will be available to be collected on the floor after you respawn. If you die a second time, you'll lose everything. Pretty standard for a Soulslike. When the game first released, picking up these souls took a really long time, and the animation lasted for about 5 seconds, which doesn't seem long, but when you're being chased by 10 enemies at once, it was pretty butt-clenching. Luckily, this was patched, and the animation is much quicker now. If you get killed by a non-trash enemy like the Calrath Knight or a boss, they'll absorb your souls, which means they'll glow purple, and you'll have to kill them again to collect your souls, which is an interesting change. Although much harder when trying to reclaim them from a boss that kicks your ass repeatedly. If you're wandering around with tens of thousands of souls, then just make sure to spend them and not regret it later. Moving forward, we find a poor soldier admiring the lovely view, and the game teaches us about backstabbing. Backstabbing works slightly differently to other games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and rather than being able to simply sneak up on an enemy and plunge your sword into their spine, you'll need to take a different approach. Every enemy in Lords of the Fallen has a posture meter, indicated by the circle on the lock-on reticle. To perform a backstab, you'll need to deplete this meter until it glows red, and then you can backstab them from any angle, which is technically a front stab. Whatever, the game calls them grievous strikes. I'm actually quite fond of this system. It puts an end to that stupid dance of spinning around enemies trying to find their sweet spot to backstab them. Plus, it's a much better implementation in PvP encounters, and avoids the problem of people waltzing rather than fighting. Eventually, after clearing the village, we arrive at our next vestige, marking a pivotal location in the game that we'll be revisiting later. I did enjoy Lords of the Fallen's world design, and the way it weaves locations together is really well done. We won't see much of it in the early game, but later on we'll be back to tackle what's behind that door. Seriously, this stupid location behind this door nearly made me flat out quit and turn the game off for good. Please, Hexworks, if you're listening, just delete this area from the game because we all hate it. Although I do love the background in this area. Does anyone else think this looks like Minas Tirith? I can almost see Denethor cosplaying as a fireball. Knocking this corpse down grants us a nice ring, the Mine Owner's Ring. This ring increases our stamina, and stamina regeneration is nice, so we equip it. Equipping trinkets in Lords of the Fallen is simple. You'll get 2 slots for rings and 1 for necklaces. Rings are like confetti at a wedding, and you'll find loads of them, but necklaces are more tricky. There's 10 necklaces overall, but by the time I finished the game, I had only found 1 lonely necklace, and it wasn't particularly good. After more exploration, we encounter a mysterious looking canal. If you try and walk through this, you'll quickly drown, as I found out. This is where the umbral mechanics of Lords of the Fallen really starts to shine, and when we cast our lantern over the water, we can see that it gets drained away, which is awesome. And in the distance, we can see an item. Now, I know earlier I said that I don't like being forced into the umbral realm against my will, but when it's used here, it's presented as a clever risk-reward system. By transitioning into the umbral realm, we can access the item and a side path, but by doing so, we open the door to a torrent of zombies who want us dead. This is a snippet of the good level design you'll see time and time again, and I really love how the developers have managed to intertwine the mechanics to heighten the player's exploration experience. By that same respect, this area also serves as an appetizer for some pretty nasty gank encounters that become more and more common as the game progresses. The enemy density is a common issue being discussed by the player's community since release, and you can see it here. When we navigate through this tunnel, everything is fine. But then coming back, all of the zombies begin to awaken and you're left to contend with a whole group of them. What do you call a group of zombies? A school of zombies? I have no idea. If you're unfortunate enough to get stuck in this trap, you'll likely get killed the first time you see it. In this case, I like the fact that developers have enticed me over with a shiny item and then caught me in a well-designed trap. It's manageable and it's avoidable, and it's rewarding to be successful. In the later areas of the game though, none of this is true, and we'll see some examples of what I mean later on. While we're on the topic of fairness, this is also a good time to highlight a key difference between Lords of the Fallen and a typical Dark Souls game. In Dark Souls, you're presented with often difficult and sometimes overwhelming odds, but it's always fair. You always know where the enemies are and what they're up to. There aren't usually any hidden or respawning enemies unless you die, of course. But here in Lords of the Fallen, this isn't the case. In the Umbral Realm, you'll see instances of enemies that will magically appear in front of you, behind you, and everywhere, and these spawns are randomized and they'll never stop. You kill one enemy and another one will shortly take its place. This isn't necessarily a negative, but it is a big difference in the game design compared to the FromSoft game. Encounters are always randomized and unpredictable, and these encounters are often not to the player's advantage, and it's a striking change when Dark Souls makes such a specific point to make sure that its encounters are difficult but always fair. Also, this guy is not having a good day. We eventually meet the Iron Wayfarer again in a small building, and he mumbles some more umbral nonsense at us and gives us a vestige seed. These vestige seeds enable the player to place down temporary vestige points, providing you have a seed available. Vestige seeds can be grown on any patch of umbral flower bed encountered throughout the world, and your controller will vibrate when you're nearby an umbral point of interest, which is nice so that you don't miss them. These umbral flower patches are really common, so you'll not be starved for checkpoints, providing you have enough seeds, but when you plant one it's a one-way ticket, and you can only have one at a time, so you need to plan your checkpoints carefully if you need to backtrack. It's also worth mentioning that these umbral flower beds won't be available to you in New Game Plus, meaning that you'll have to rely on only vestiges as checkpoints. I can only shudder at the thought of not having these checkpoints available, especially when you see some of the PTSD invoking zones later on. While writing this, I was made aware of a noticeable change to this mechanic. After some backlash from the community, the developers have added a recent patch. Now, in New Game Plus, you'll encounter less and less permanent vestiges as the game goes on, meaning that by the time you get to New Game Plus 3, you'll only have 2 vestiges available in the whole game. one of them being at the hub, which you'll see later on. This is an interesting change and still keeps the difficulty of New Game Plus high, but it's reversed the original method of removing umbral seeds, and now makes the player rely on these seeds for the majority of their progression, and it'll be interesting to see how the community feels about this change. In my opinion, the umbral seed mechanic is a welcome addition, because it allows the gameplay to be more dynamic. It changes how you traverse each level. Because there are so many places that you can put down a seed, one player might have enough seeds to make a specific area a cakewalk, while another player might be out of seeds and have a tougher time. These seeds also change how you interact with specific shortcuts, and change how you route through each area. It adds a nice layer of dynamic difficulty and progression that differentiates each player's experience, and if you do go through the hellhole of New Game Plus, your run will be slightly different because of this seed mechanic. We emerge from the building and go up a flight of steps, and get greeted with a gorgeous view of the surrounding area. From here we can see even more mysterious red beacons, which we'll learn about soon. This is the type of environmental design that I love. Like I said in the beginning, I do feel like I'm going on a journey, like a hobbit going to Mordor. It's exactly like going to Mordor. This area is also covered in fire, and if you look closely enough, you'll see that the developers have placed an item nicely in the middle, which is a great way to both reward the player and teaching them that fire will kill you. This area also marks our first encounter with our first real boss, Pyetta of She-Blessed Renewal. Honestly, this might be one of my favourite boss encounters in the entire game, and despite its formidable difficulty, I had a blast fighting her.
O holy Aureus, by your radiance grant me the strength to continue to endure these dark days, to lay bare the path to salvation for my wayward brothers and sisters, so we may walk it together, and to strike down all those who would see our will defied. Even as our suffering continued, I honored my pledge of patience to the exactor. And yet you now appear before me, a stranger, bearing what was not yours to receive. A betrayal made flesh, and one I cannot brook.
Pyetta is a multi-phase fight, and in her first phase you'll see a few basic mechanics. She'll use her longsword to swing and execute combo attacks, and this thing has a surprisingly long range. She'll also fire blasts of light from her sword too, and this can be pretty tricky to dodge when you're first learning the timings. When she hits about 60% health, she'll sprout wings and soar to one end of the arena, executing a massive aerial holy attack which covers the center of the room. So stick to one side and you'll be fine. Keep in mind that she'll also rain down holy death on the same area, so remain still until she chills out a bit. Phase 2 is similar to Phase 1, except this time she'll summon holy spirits to do her bidding, and she'll fire a long-range holy creeping attack that's easily dodged. The most challenging aspect of this fight is just knowing when to strike. Patience is key, and when you've mastered the timing, you smash her in the face with your giant hammer or chosen peripheral of death. Once she's taken enough damage, she'll split the room into 3 quadrants. Tridents? I don't know. Anyway, just make sure to stand in the one area that doesn't have a spirit charging up an attack, or you'll be hit by a large unavoidable AoE. This battle stands out to me as one of the most well executed and difficult fights of the entire game, which is both a blessing and a curse, seeing as it's one of the very first boss fights. What really caught my attention here is the great use of area effects, which is something you don't really see in many Souls-like games. The use of the entire boss room and the use of the camera which zooms out when the boss does a large range attack is really awesome. Combining that with the awesome orchestral choir and the colossal holy entities whizzing past make this a really atmospheric and enjoyable fight. 11 out of 10. If you're struggling with this fight, you have the option to summon NPC characters to help you as well. In this case, the Iron Wayfarer will hang out before the boss door, so you can summon him for some extra help. The problem with summoning NPCs to help is that oftentimes they'll get hit by AoE attacks because they don't know how to dodge correctly, and it really becomes awkward to watch your poor summon die while the boss rains down hell. Half the time my summon died before even phase 2 began. After a long and hard fight, Pyetta finally goes down, and we're rewarded with an umbral stigma. These memories can be activated by soulflaying them, and you'll get a bit of backstory and a specific boss reward for doing so. These rewards are similar to boss souls from other Souls-like games, and can be traded in later for weapons, spells and armor specific to the boss you obtain them from, which is pretty cool. Once we've killed Pyetta, we do some more exploring and eventually arrive at Skyrest Bridge, which acts as a home hub area like Majula or Firelink Shrine. Any NPCs you've met will hang out here for you to talk to and trade with, and once you've unlocked them, you'll be able to talk to the blacksmith as well, who can upgrade your gear. The environment here is lovely to look at, and the soundtrack exudes a nice relaxing quality. I've always loved hub areas in Souls-like games because they establish a soothing tone and atmosphere compared to the harsh world outside. A very similar feeling to the safe rooms in Resident Evil or Silent Hill games. This area also looks really nice when you swap to the Umbral Realm, and the area takes on a more sinister and macabre tone, though it begs the question, When I transfer into the Umbral Realm, do these NPCs come with me? I can still speak to them. This is a conspiracy, I tell you. And while we're on the topic of unexplained mysteries, 1. Why does my flail freak out when I'm in this specific corridor? This never happens anywhere else. And 2. Why is this guy so tall? Speaking of the Umbral Realm, a visit there in this room specifically reveals an NPC. An eccentric hunchback individual who bears an uncanny resemblance to the mages we fought earlier. He also looks a bit like PS1 Hagrid. Molnu kindly acts as our one-stop shop for all things Umbral. He'll offer you purchases like Umbral seeds and allow you to trade in the boss item that we collected earlier. Later on, when you collect the right item, Molnu will also allow us to upgrade our Umbral lamp, collecting specific bonuses in combat. Another really important item that you can get from this guy is the Rebirth Chrysalis. This is a one and done item which allows us to completely respec our stats. Pretty useful if you want to swap builds. But be wary though, because these items are hideously rare, and I don't think I ever found a single one in my whole playthrough. So if you buy this item, use it wisely. Lastly, Pyetta will also appear in Skyrest Bridge 2, and she's had a sudden change of heart and becomes our BFF. From here on, she'll be available as an NPC summon like the Iron Wayfarer, so that's cool. Pyetta also becomes an important NPC, and through her you'll be able to upgrade your Sanguinarix. To do this, you'll need to find saintly quintessences scattered around the world. If you bring these back to Pyetta, she'll give you one more stack of healing goodness. Before we leave the safe confines of the hub zone, Exacta Dunmire makes a dramatic re-entry. Do you remember this guy from the start of the game? He tells us that we need to cleanse 5 beacons throughout the world to stop the big bad Adyr from being released from their prison. This is effectively the main goal of the game, and you'll be travelling to and from areas to cleanse these beacons moving forward. We continue our adventure over the Skyrest Bridge, and I have to say this area looks really nice. Okay, I take it back, fuck this place. This is a theme you'll see a lot of in the next few areas. Unexpected enemy ambushes and then falling swiftly to your death. A lot of enemies in this area are placed behind boxes or hidden behind corners, and are literally designed to catch you off guard and gank you, which is fine when it's used sparingly, but this happens more than I'd like, so it gets pretty annoying pretty quick. It's like in a horror movie. It's fine to have a jump scare here and there, but if it's overused it becomes more stale than old bread. Another annoying feature comes into play here as well. When you attack, your character moves forward, only slightly but a lot further than you might be used to in other similar games. This means you'll have to be pretty careful not to fling yourself off an edge when fighting an enemy near a drop. With that in mind, I have to say that this area looks gorgeous. Lords of the Fallen really does take its Umbral thematic design and rocks it up to an 11. In the distance we can see huge monolithic statues and huge tendrils poking out in all directions. If you listen closely, you can also hear the wailing of ghosts and crying of babies, which adds some really nice cosmic horror to the atmosphere. We eventually make it to the other side of the bridge and prepare to fight another boss, the Scourge Sister Delith. This boss is technically the second real boss, after our recent showdown with Pyetta, and I was quaking in my pixelated boots when I saw the UI appear. However, this fight isn't that difficult at all. Also, why is this woman wearing a traffic cone on her head? Maybe she's going for the construction worker aesthetic. Before we can damage her, we'll need to smash the Umbral Parasite nearby. For this, you'll need to either go into the Umbral Realm and smack it with your sword, or use a lantern to pop it. Easy peasy. This boss has a few predictable combo attacks with her mace, and uses some holy spells which can be avoided by using the pillars or timing your dodges. I like the use of the environmental objects here. Pillars are a simple but interesting way to keep players on their toes. Once we've taught Mrs. Traffic Cone a lesson, you'll be able to grab a saintly quintessence by soulflaying the nearby statue in the Umbral Realm, which we can then deliver back to Pyetta in Skyrest to pimp out our Sanguinarix for more healing. After defeating Delith, we arrive for the first time in Pilgrim's Perch, although this place really should be called Pilgrim's Descent. This is one of the first areas in the game that presents the player with some actual challenge outside of the boss fights. The game starts to combine various mechanics together, using the Umbral Realm as a means to unlock shortcuts required to progress, and the use of large groups of enemies to test the player's skills and patience. Oh, and the use of forced platforming and hidden gankers waiting to grant you a one-way ticket off the nearest cliff. This is where you'll encounter the Buckethead too. No, not that Buckethead. This enemy is something straight out of Silent Hill, and hits like a truck, so you better get good at dodging his fast attacks. Or if you're feeling fruity, just use the Soulflay mechanic to pull them off the cliff. When you use the Soulflay ability on an enemy, you'll have a few seconds where you can control the direction of their soul. Once the effect ends, the enemy bounces back into their body, so pull those bastards off the edge and forget they ever existed. There was one specific location in Pilgrim's Perch that really pissed me off. There's an area where you'll need to navigate around a shortcut by hopping into the Umbral Realm to take an alternate route. Up until now, we've only really seen small gaps and doorways being accessible through the Umbral Realm. But here, not only is it a required route the first time around, but you'll also have to contend with an entire side area filled with horrible enemies. Once you get to the other end, plop the ladder down and just never go there again. This is where another mechanic comes into play as well. See that eyeball gauge in the top right? Well, that's a timer, and it marks the time spent conducting Umbral escapades. The longer you stay, the higher the bar gets. When this starts flashing red, it's time to get the hell out, because you'll be attacked by respawning red Grim Reapers, which will just decimate you. The problem with this mechanic is that once you're in the Umbral Realm, you're pretty much dead anyway. You can only leave the Umbral Realm by finding an effigy or resting at a vestige, and you're likely going to be quite far away from either of these, so it's mostly just an instant death. It's like when you win the level in Vampire Survivors, and get rewarded with a nice scythe to the face. Lovely. After some more platforming and clearing of Umbral blockages, we eventually unlock a door, which leads to another vestige and an NPC named Byron. Just chilling. There's also another door that we won't need to come back until much later on. Another nice bit of foreshadowing. Also, if you haven't noticed them yet, Lords of the Fallen presents us with a nice multiplayer mechanic here. The Red Lanterns. These are another risk-reward system that allow players to spice up the nearby enemies. When you soulflay a red lantern, it'll fly into the soul of a nearby enemy, making them take less damage and deal more damage. They'll also drop better rewards too, so it's worth using if you're brave enough. These red lanterns only appear in specific spots throughout the game, and have a chance to spawn when another player dies in their world. Although, while playing Lords of the Fallen, the multiplayer barely worked for me, so I didn't see many of these lanterns outside of the normal predictable spots. This is a pretty cool mechanic on paper though, and allows for some meta interaction between players, and is an interesting evolution of the blood pools from Dark Souls, which mark where players die for everyone to laugh at. The area underneath this vestige also contains a few points of interest that you don't want to miss. One path leads to a boss room required to progress further, but there's also a slightly hidden side path, and if you listen closely in this area, you'll hear struggling of someone locked up in a cage. I completely missed this area the first time around, so I had to come back to it later, but down here is a difficult shield-bearing enemy which drops a key. Use the key on the nearby cage, and you'll unlock the blacksmith who goes back to town ready for you to use her services. Nice. Doubling back, we go down a few elevators and arrive in a suspicious-looking boss area with a woman standing in the middle. This absolute hellhole is home to Gentle Gaverus, Mistress of Hounds. This stupid boss took me a few tries, mainly due to her canine entourage, which overwhelm you while you're trying to fight. As you wrestle with the 3 doggos, the boss will take pot shots at you, which become difficult to dodge when you're trying to keep track of 3 dogs at the same time. And even if you manage to kill these dogs, she'll summon more as the fight goes on. There's a few ways to deal with this fight. You can either try and manage the dogs and kill them when they spawn, or do what I did and ignore the dogs completely and smash her face in until she's dead. She's pretty easy when she's one-on-one, and she'll do a smoke bomb attack and teleport somewhere else if you get too close. Just sprint around the room and smack her whenever you get a chance, and eventually you'll beat her. But that's not even the hard part. The hard part about this fight is the stupid boss run, which makes you have to sit through 2 elevator rides every time you die. Not 1, but 2. And these elevators take ages to go up and down, and you can't even use them to send it back up again after you die, like you could in Dark Souls. The levers here only go one way, so every single death against this boss ends up being a case of respawning, pulling the lever, waiting for the elevator to arrive, descending in the elevator, dodging these mages, pulling another lever, waiting for another elevator, going down again, and then arriving at the boss door. And sometimes I get killed almost immediately and have to do it all over again. This whole dance takes about 2 minutes every time you die, and yeah, I timed it because what else have I got to do while I'm waiting for this stupid elevator? Also, when you descend, your satchel actually flaps upwards, which is pretty cool. Next we arrive in the Forsaken Fen. This area is both horrendous and awesome at the same time, and whenever you enter this area you'll get this sound effect. It's really bothering me that I can't work out where I've heard this sound before. If anyone else recognises it, let me know down in the comments. We meet another NPC in this area and he tells us that he's decided to become a travelling merchant. Fair enough. And I've got to be honest, this area made me step back and look down in awe at the gorgeous distant scenery and landscapes. The misty mountains and the swamp below with the fog rolling through. In the distance we can also see another beacon of light, emitting from a nearby tree, and this time it's much closer. I love this feeling of silent progression that you get, observing your surroundings and knowing that you're getting closer and closer to your goal. Almost immediately after the last boss, we encounter a mysteriously stable bridge and of course, it breaks and we get thrown into a fight with the Rotten. Oh, sorry, wrong game. This hulking heavyweight meatbag is the Congregator of Flesh, and he's not too scary despite his size. The hardest part about this fight, again, is not the boss itself, but the camera which gets stuck in between the boss's girthy thighs and the wall. He does have a few delayed attacks which you'll need to have some patience for when dodging, or else you'll feel like it's Shrove Tuesday. Get it? Pancakes. After this boss is dead, we enter the swamps again, and get faced with another Umbral predicament. The majority of this area is completely flooded, as you might imagine a swamp would be, but in the Umbral realm they're mostly just dried up puddles, so you'll need to hop back and forth between dimensions in this area to progress. Although I've got to say, the contrast between the deep water-filled swamp in the Axiom realm and the dark, dried out lakes in the Umbral realm is a really cool juxtaposition. These areas are laid on top of each other in real time, but each realm poses a different type of gameplay challenge, and a different path to follow, and I really like this. This is one of the best examples of the Umbral realm being used in a well thought out manner. There's even enemies in this area which function differently depending on your chosen realm. In the real world, you'll see enemies crawling out of the water towards you, and you'll see these strange poison mages on stilts, which look completely stupid when you're in the Umbral realm, but then in the normal world you can actually see that they're using them to hover above the water's surface, and I don't know if this is stupidity or absolute genius. We place down our next vestige seed to get a new checkpoint after the last boss, which ends up being almost pointless because the next vestige is actually really close by. And this happens a lot. Whenever you think you'll need to use a vestige seed, 99% of the time you probably don't. But in the end it's not a huge deal because you can get an unlimited amount of these anyway. We continue our journey into the swamp in the Umbral realm to avoid drowning, and this is where the game first starts to reveal its inner masochist. Compared to some of the later stages in the game, this area is a cakewalk looking back, but still, going through this for the first time and at a lower level, it was one of the first locations where the difficulty really started to ramp up. In most cases, the game does show that it was designed around fighting large groups of enemies, due to the fact that we have mechanics to help us with this, including the weapon sets having large, wide swing attacks, and the ability to regenerate health by attacking enemies. I know a lot of people on the forums were complaining about the large amount of enemies and the difficulty of this area, but honestly I thought it was very fair, and allowed the player to combat this difficulty with the mechanics given to us by the game. What isn't fair, however, is when the game starts to throw large groups of difficult enemies at us at once, and I'll get back to that later. After quite a lot of death, exploration and frustration, we eventually fight our way through the swamp into a village and arrive at the next boss, the Hushed Saint. So far, we fought 5 bosses excluding the tutorial boss, and out of all of them, Adyr and the Hushed Saint have been the most memorable for me, and I think this is a theme across Lords of the Fallen. Some of the bosses are actually really well done, very memorable and really enjoyable, but the majority of bosses littered in between these memorable fights are effectively just beefed up normal enemies with basic mechanics, which then just get reused later on. This boss fight marks the first turning point in the story and guards the first beacon in the nearby tree. The Hushed Saint makes his grand entrance on an undead horse and uses his mount to attack us while riding around the arena. He also has the ability to spawn flower patches which slowly creep towards you, and a really fast spear attack that'll catch you off guard if you're not paying attention. This is another example of the developers using wide camera angles and large areas to their advantage, and it works really well. The hardest part of this fight is making sure to keep an eye on where the Saint is so that you don't get 360 no-scoped by a spear. Eventually he'll jump off the horse and attack you head on, and this is where you can finally deal some damage to him. If you're quick enough, you can also pop the parasites nearby to stagger him. After a few rounds of an extremely unfair jousting match, the boss will split up from his horse and enter phase 2. In this phase, the boss will attack separately from his undead steed, so you'll need to keep an eye on both of them at the same time. This was a pretty tricky fight overall and probably took me about 10 tries. The hardest part about this was the need for spatial awareness and patience when waiting for the right time to attack. You've also got the ability to summon NPC summons here as well, and I'd probably recommend picking Adyr as she can heal and does ranged attacks. But we faced the same similar problem as last time in the fact that NPCs don't really do well against AoE attacks, and unfortunately Adyr doesn't last long. I think that the developers should really have given NPCs more HP reduction against bosses' AoE attacks, because it feels really underwhelming when you sit there and watch your friend get slaughtered, and for some reason the NPCs take the vast majority of the aggro. So most of the time, in fights with NPC summons, I just ended up rushing them in the hopes of killing them before the boss killed my friends. Finally, after a long and hard session, the boss goes down, and we're treated to a nice cutscene of us cleansing the beacon. And from now on, this beacon will emit white light into the sky instead of red. And this is an awesome use of environmental design to signify player progression. And in most areas, you'll be able to look up and see just how far you've come by the colour of the beacons in the sky. It's also worth noting here that you also have the option to not cleanse the beacon at all, which offers an alternate ending to the game if you take this path. Some NPC quests are also only completable if you make sure not to cleanse the beacons, so make sure you know what you want to do before you start. We cleanse the beacon and travel through Fitzroy Gorge, a misty mountainous path which ends in a literal battlefield across the road from Hogwarts. Inside the castle we find an optional boss called the Crimson Rector Percival, and I feel sorry for whoever's mother would call him that. This fight is pretty simple one-on-one. Once you've got the hang of his attacks, the only real thing to look out for here is the boss's healing ability, which causes him to glow and heal over time. You can break him out of it by bursting a nearby umbral parasite, or by soul flaying him when he does the attack, so make sure to save those charges for when you need them.
Yeah, boy!
After that's done and dusted, we travel through more mountainous regions and a cave, which is home to lovely fire-breathing dogs which explode on death. And we also see some really annoying crossbow serpents. These crossbow guys have some really hard-hitting fire attacks, including a bombardment spell which rains fireballs from above, and a fire trap which causes you to explode if you touch it. I don't know if the AI is actually programmed to hide behind these traps, but it honestly feels like they are. We arrive at a bridge that looks mysteriously like another boss arena and get charged by the Ruiner. Though he really should have a plural at the end of his name, because this isn't the last time we'll be seeing him. The Ruiner has a few mechanics, including the ability to spawn firebombs scattered around the arena, and periodically summons a totem which buffs him. So when he poops out a totem, make sure to move to the other end of the bridge out of his range. He's also got a nasty shield attack which fires, well, fire. This attack hits really hard and has a potential to one-hit you if you're not dodging quickly enough, so make sure you pay attention. I enjoyed this fight though. The developers have used the environment to their advantage again here by presenting the player with a boss in a long and thin arena and requires the player to move from end to end, using the boss's AoE attacks to facilitate this. One of the more memorable bosses.
Hold on!
Once the Ruiner gets ruined, we're safe to travel up to the outskirts of Kalrath City, and the enemy density starts to ramp up massively here. Throughout your adventures here, you'll be fighting explodey fire dogs, crossbow serpents, armoured dogs, zombies, mages and Kalrath knights all at the same time. And if you're lucky, you'll also encounter respawning versions of the Grim Reaper we saw earlier. These guys have a really nasty teleport attack and can knock you into the Umbral Realm if you're unlucky enough to be shining your lantern nearby. Eventually we make our way to another suspicious looking boss arena and get challenged to a duel by the Light Reaper again. Do you remember this guy from way back in the beginning who desecrated us? Well, this time I'm ready. Okay, maybe not. Moving on, we make it to the lower reaches of the city itself, and I have to say, this area looks incredible with its burning buildings and the sound of wailing ghosts in the background. This is probably one of the most atmospheric and aesthetic areas in the entire game, and makes a lovely change from the grey mountains and deathly swamps that we've seen so far. The level design also matches the enemy design in the area as well, which is a nice touch. You'll find burning zombies which explode if you get too close, which is awesome. After burning our eyebrows on the nearby vestige, we encounter yet another boss fight. One of the most annoying enemies in the whole game, the Fallen Enchantress. This boss is actually fairly easy when you know what to do. She'll start the fight surrounded by a shield of fire which makes her impossible to damage, so you'll need to pop the umbral parasites that are tethered to her which are scattered around the room. This is a mechanic we'll see more of in the future, but in my opinion it's not very fun at all. Essentially you're just praying to the gods that you can sprint over and hit the parasites without dying, and it feels more like a game of luck than anything else. Once the parasites are gone and the boss's shield disappears, she has a few attacks but nothing really scary. She'll bombard the area with fireballs, and she has a short-range flamethrower attack which is really easy to dodge. She also has a really hard-hitting fireball attack, which might one-shot you if you're not paying much attention, and I am actually ashamed to admit it, but this fight took me over 10 tries. The boss arena was also pretty disappointing because it feels like half of it was cut off by the butterfly barrier. That's a cool name for a band, right? I would have preferred it if the arena spanned out a bit further to be less cramped and allowed you to fight around the tree in the middle, but maybe the developers thought that this would make the fight too easy. Who knows? After felling the Fallen Enchantress, we continue through the lower levels of the city, and the level design starts to get really confusing. I'm not sure if I went the wrong way or not, but I kept opening shortcuts back to areas that I didn't need to go back to, which makes me think that these areas were designed without the Vestige Seed mechanic in mind. There were also a few more annoyances in this burning hellhole as well, including the fact that certain fights take place in tight spaces, like alleyways. It's almost impossible to hit an enemy with a combo without getting staggered on the wall. Kalrath is also one of the first areas in the game where we start to encounter reused boss enemies as well. Mostly the Fallen Enchantress and the Ruiner from earlier, but you won't just see them once. Oh no, these guys will start to pop up around nearly every single corner, and in later areas of the game, you'll even start to see multiple Ruiners charging at you at once, which is ridiculous. After more mental pain and anguish, we begin our ascent into the upper levels of the city, but navigation becomes quite difficult, even if you took the enemies away. During my initial playthrough, I struggled to understand whether or not I needed to move up or down, and the intricate level design combined with a lack of general direction became quite daunting. There's a small section in Lower Kalrath which requires you to jump down, right after a vestige and into an adjacent street. But because each area just looks so similar, I never knew whether or not I was dropping down into a new area or unlocking a shortcut, and sometimes your brain will just subconsciously decide to disregard it as an option, and this cryptic level design caught me out more than once in various locations across the game. Eventually I managed to engage my brain and we drop down and fight our way to the next vestige. Along the way we encounter a lovely combination of another ruiner and a mendacious visage, an optional boss from back in the swamp area. From here on out the enemy design starts to fizzle, and you'll be seeing mostly enemies that you've fought before, and this extends to the majority of the second half of the game as well. Finally, after that, we arrive at the next boss, and we're in for a treat. A lovely, disgusting, terrifying treat. This blazing battleground is home to the Spurned Progeny, my second favourite boss in the entire game, following Pyetta. This ugly bastard has such an imposing and terrifying presence. Personally, large-scale boss fights in Souls-like games can be the most challenging and are often the least enjoyable, because most of the time you can only see their legs, leading to the lack of character design and personality. But also, when you can barely fit the boss on the screen, their telegraphed attacks become more difficult to read and anticipate. But this wasn't the case with the Spurned Progeny. This hulking mess has a lot of tricks up his sleeve. The first phase is relatively simple and suffers from the classic legs problem, but if you angle the camera properly and make use of the free aim rather than lock on, you'll be able to keep track of what he's up to. Just make sure to avoid his massive swinging attacks and you'll be fine. He has a fire attack which also spawns an outward circle of death, so make sure to roll through this at the right time. And if you stand too close to his butt, he'll attempt to sit on you, so that's fun. Once he's taken enough damage, the boss will cover the entire lower level of the arena in deadly hot lava, which forces you to move upwards onto the castle ramparts, which I thought was really cool. This is one of the few bosses in Lords of the Fallen that encompasses multiple phases and effectively uses raid-style mechanics, which is so much fun. In phase 2, we fight the boss head on, using the castle walls so we can actually see what's going on. The developers realised that large-scale bosses have innate problems due to their size, and here they level the playing field, which is such a breath of fresh air. If anything, the boss becomes more scary because now I can see just how big and scary he actually is. He has a few more attacks you'll need to watch out for in phase 2. Mostly more side swing attacks which hit really hard if you're not paying attention, and in this phase he vomits out his own arm and attacks with that as well, which is lovely. After taking more damage, he'll cover the upper platform in lava as well, which means now you need to run to the other side of the castle walls, one of the only safe areas left in the arena. At this point my heart was racing, wondering if I get engulfed in lava, but thankfully it disappears after a while. The fight effectively follows this pattern. As long as you know where you are and where you need to be when the next lava attack begins, it's pretty easy. This fight also has a soft phase 3. Near the end of his lifespan, the boss will begin to charge up a spirit bomb which causes a wide AoE attack, so you'll need to run and hide behind the walls nearby. Surprisingly, I was able to understand this mechanic on my first try, with only a few seconds to figure it out in the heat of the moment. Now I'm not tooting my own horn here, but it stands as a testament to good boss design. I didn't have to die, reload and look up a guide and so on, so props to the developers here. After that, we descend to the bottom of the arena and smack the boss in the ankle until victory is achieved. Overall, the Spurned Progeny is probably one of the more memorable and enjoyable fights in Lords of the Fallen, due to its clever use of the multiple phase mechanics and environmental design. And obviously this guy is way too big to be reused later, so thankfully we only see him once. After the death of that ugly bastard, we move on towards the upper levels of the city again, and this area is no joke, and I got stuck here for quite a while, mostly due to the difficult enemy design, and because this area is absolutely rammed with mimics for some reason. I haven't talked about mimics yet, so here we go. In Lords of the Fallen, mimics take on a slightly different form to what you might be used to. They like to play hide and seek inside items, and if you mistake them for treasure, they'll take your head off. Isn't that what helmets are for? It took me a really long time to figure out what item mimics look like, just because they're so rare to see up until now. But if you look closely, you'll see that their tail is shaped like an S, rather than going straight up. This is a simple observation, but when you have no idea what you're looking for, and your punishment is the death penalty, it takes a while to figure it out. And from here up until the end of time, I never trusted an item pickup ever again, so thanks to the developers for that long-lasting PTSD. We travel down into a courtyard area and meet another fallen enchantress, but this time she has a lovely zombie entourage. When she sees you, she'll light them on fire for even more fun, and don't forget about the ruiner as well. Yeah, here you'll need to fight both the mage and the ruiner at the same time, which is just amazing, and if you die you'll be faced with even more enemies in the Umbral Realm, including one of these stupid fat butterflies which seem to spawn yet more zombies. I hated this area, and after a while I just skipped it and ran through just to save my sanity. I also got lost here for an embarrassing amount of time, mostly because it's hard to figure out where to go when you've got a ruiner trying to skewer you and an enchantress trying to barbecue you like a kebab. After some more wandering and some emotional moments, I finally realised that this door can be opened, but the point still stands. This area is so convoluted with buildings and doors, half the problem comes again from the lack of general direction. I wasn't sure if I was even in the right area, or if this was a dead end and I missed another route early on. We eventually make it through the Calrath Hellhole and into the Sunless Skyne, the mining tunnels deep underneath the city. The Sunless Skyne is an interwoven maze of interesting shortcuts, claustrophobic tunnels, tricky enemies, poison hazards and firebombs on the walls. Sounds like a fun day out. Despite the difficulty of this area, it's actually really nicely designed, with twisting tunnels and shortcuts which intertwine together to create new progression routes, while keeping the actual size of the area quite small. Although this area is well designed, it still presents the problem that I had in the previous Calrath levels. I can't tell if I'm supposed to be going upward or downward, and I know this might seem like a small issue, but because I don't have a general goal, it's hard to tell if the direction I'm travelling in is the right way or not. It's good to have intricate level design, but it would also be nice to know if I'm travelling in the right way. There is one area in the Sunless Skyne that I thought was really well done. Eventually you'll encounter a central chamber in the middle with a small lake. When you transition into the Umbral Realm, you'll be able to explore the watery depths without issue. Well, if you ignore the mendacious visage, who definitely didn't scare the shit out of me. After exploring, we find a lever which activates a nearby dam mechanism, which drains the water away from the pool, allowing us to explore without travelling into the Umbral Realm. But not only that, this dam also now functions as a bridge across the gap, which acts as a shortcut. And I love the way the developers are able to combine the water mechanic, the Umbral mechanic, the lever mechanic and the shortcut mechanic into one great piece of complex level design. This area is also home to more fiery Calrath knights, mages, wombs and exploding dogs, so that's fun. It's also worth mentioning that even though these enemies are the same enemies that we saw in previous levels, they're now scaled to their new location, so they have more health and do a lot more damage. And while trying to defend myself in claustrophobic sewers, against a mix of melee enemies, exploding enemies and ranged enemies all at the same time, while trying to avoid catching my sword on a wall, or god forbid an exploding trap, became really old really quickly. Eventually, after navigating the sewers and the tunnels, we find an exit which marks the progression point between Lower and Upper Calrath. But just before that, we encounter a gorgeous area tucked away at the bottom called the Revelation Depths. This area is also riddled with silly platforming sections which make no sense. Why, in a game with terrible jumping, do we have platforming mechanics? I wouldn't mind if the jumping was an easy task, but when your athleticism skills rival that of a one-legged toddler, it just feels like the developers are actively trying to show off their downfalls. I know all Soulslike games have bad jumping and bad platforming, but not all games need to follow this recipe, especially when it actively makes the game worse. For now, we ignore this optional area and continue our journey upward, and encounter the next boss, although I use the term boss very loosely. The entrance that this boss makes is subtle to say the least. It's just, hey, here you go, here's the skin stealer. Aside from that, the teeny tiny boss arena is actually really cool, and works well considering that this boss is effectively just a beefed up normal enemy. But with the close combat attacks and one-on-one fighting mechanics, it feels like you're playing a fighting game like Mortal Kombat or Tekken, and for some reason this whole area reminded me of Akuji the Heartless on PS1. Does anyone else remember that gem? This fight, while not lasting very long, really brings back that classic feeling of a Souls-like game, and it's great when the game shows off its roots and shows that it can actually do this type of gameplay well. I just wish Lords of the Fallen did more of it. After a real scintillating fight, we ascend through an exceptionally long cage ride to Upper Calrath.
What a thrill.
In Axiom, Upper Calrath is actually pretty deserted, but when playing in the Umbral Realm you'll be facing off against Grim Reapers and more zombies than an episode of The Walking Dead, so I suggest that you stick to the normal dimension here. It's really odd that this area wasn't used more because it's a really nice looking area apart from the floor, which is really glitchy in this area for some reason. Here we encounter a door which is blocked by some sort of mass preventing our progress, but remember this area because it will be really important later. After more tangles with the fallen enchantress and more exploding zombies, we arrive at a suspicious looking boss arena again, but this time there's no boss. Instead we face off against the ruiner and not just one but 5 dogs. Do you think that's enough dogs, game? This fight was absolutely horrendous, so instead I used my powers of retreating like a small child and continued forward. Not long afterwards we encounter our second beacon, and I thought this was a bit off. There's no boss here, there's no story, there's nothing. Combining this with the lack of, well, anything in this area almost feels like the developers were a bit rushed when making this level. Remember at the beginning of the video when I asked if this game would make me feel like I've gone on a long and harrowing journey? In Dark Souls 2 for instance, the whole premise was to collect 4 boss souls located down 4 specific pathways which interlink from the game's main hub, each route eventually culminating in a final giant soul boss fight. When you get a soul, you can look back and see just how far you've come. You can remember each path and its areas and the grand boss fight at the end. But here in Lords of the Fallen, we just activate a beacon in a mostly empty area and just move on. There's no actual emotional connection being made here, it's just hey, here you go, next. Once we've lit the beacon, we encounter another interior area with the Iron Wayfarer again, and this time he's a little bit depressed. He tells us that things went bad and he had to fight his way out of town, but interestingly enough, if you go into the Umbral Realm here, you get another memory which depicts our friend seemingly mowing down innocent civilians. So I'm guessing he's not telling us the whole truth, and I like this character development. This area also connects all the way back to where we fought Pyeta near Skyrest Bridge at the start of the game, and this is pretty cool. It's a great feeling when you uncover connections between older areas, and it makes the whole world feel connected and makes everything feel interesting to explore. It's also pretty interesting that Upper Kalrath is so close to where we began. Even though we felt like we travelled pretty far, we haven't actually gone anywhere at all. The next 2 areas are a little different from the rest of the game, and can be tackled in effectively any order you want. Our destination is back through one of the vestiges we encountered earlier in the village. Remember this door? Well, now we've got a key and we can go inside, although I really don't want to. This key was given to us by another NPC, Andreas of Ebb, who sells you the key really early on in the game, but if you don't purchase it, he'll disappear and drop the key in his place, near the Pyeta boss arena. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the game doesn't really explain how to get this key, and if you didn't already know, you'd be wandering around for ages. The area behind this door is the Fief of the Chill Curse, whatever the hell that means. The misty shrouded woods begin to turn into dull, frosty mountain ranges, and I was excited when I entered this area. Little did I know that this is by far the worst location in the entire game, and my motivation really dwindled here, and more than once, I questioned what the hell I was doing with my life and really wanted to just quit. After an encounter with some undead in the frosty caverns, we arrive in an ice-filled clearing and come face to face with the next boss, Kin Ranger Guardian Folard. Even his name makes me hate him. This guy is tough, and by tough I don't mean mechanically intensive. During your encounter here, you'll face off against the boss, 3 dogs, and a mendacious visage all at the same time. It's fair to say I absolutely hate this boss. I hate the run back to the boss because I had to do it so many times. I hate this area for reasons that we'll see later. I hate the dogs, I hate the stupid head, and I hate the chill effect. Okay, tantrum over, let's do it. The problem with this encounter is that all of the enemies are connected by an umbral tether, which needs to be smashed in order to dish out damage. But because you're being attacked by so many enemies at once, it's basically a test of RNG to determine whether or not you'll be able to do it without dying. There's 2 ways to get through this. One, you can cheese the boss, which takes a little bit of effort. Once the umbral cord has been smashed, if you quit to the main menu and then rejoin the game, you'll log back in right outside the boss arena, which then gives you time to use ranged attacks to pick the dogs off. Once the dogs are dead, this fight is an absolute pushover. This boss has a few basic combo attacks which you'll need to time correctly, but it's just a matter of patience when it's one-on-one. The trick to this fight is just making sure that you don't go into the Umbral Realm, so you can avoid fighting the stupid head. If you don't want to cheese the boss, you can just use a summon as well, although there's no NPC summons available for this fight, but you can still use the multiplayer mechanic. Speaking of multiplayer, this is actually the first time I managed to get multiplayer to work. In Lords of the Fallen, you have both PvE and PvP available to you. You can summon a random player to help you, or summon a friend to help you, and you can join another player's world in an attempt to kill them. The problem with the multiplayer mechanic was that it just never really worked, and I sat here trying to beckon another fellow lampbearer into my world for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually I just gave up. I had some luck later on summoning allies by exiting and reloading the game, but at that point it's not really worth the effort. After lots and lots of deaths, I finally managed to summon another player to help me, and then this boss just became absolutely trivial. After reading up on the forums, it seems like a lot of people shared my frustration with this boss, and I can easily say that this was one of the worst bosses in the entire game, and at least somewhere on my top 10 of worst bosses in any video game ever. It's just luck whether or not you manage to smash the umbral cord in time before getting hit, and then getting lucky with the dogs. On top of that, the run back to the boss got a little infuriating as well, probably just because of the amount of times that I had to do it. I think I must have died on this boss over 20 times before I stopped counting. At long last, we give this icy boss the cold shoulder and continue into the Fief of the Chill Curse. But unfortunately, this boss is just a taste of the hell to come. This is the main location in Lords of the Fallen where 2 things become immediately apparent. One being that enemy variety really starts to drop off here, and the only new enemies you fight are basically just reused bosses. The second problem is with the sheer amount of enemies that you have to fight just really makes this whole area really frustrating and controller-breakingly difficult. This area is filled with enchantresses, ruiners, skin stealers and frost dogs which cause the chill effect, which makes your stamina get cut in half. We also encounter a new type of enemy in this area, the Spectral Bowman, who teleports in and out of view and fires a really hard-hitting and fast arrow projectile. Even when I knew it was coming, it still managed to hit me half of the time. And considering the amount of enemies in the area, I ended up running past the majority of them, so trying to avoid these ice archers became really difficult. This whole area ended up becoming more of a frosty obstacle course than an area to explore. Trying to fight through literally hundreds of enemies, all with ranged attacks, chill attacks, and heavy hitting melee attacks, became more of a test of extreme patience, and if you die, they all respawn, which is fine in practice, but in this area there are so many tricky fights and difficult enemies that it just becomes easier to run through the whole thing. And I barely had any time to take in what was actually really great surroundings and good level design. This area contains an entire village that's been swallowed up by the earth and is half sunken in frosty water, which is really cool. You need to navigate through flooded buildings by swapping between the Umbral Realm and the normal realm, but the problem is, because I'm literally running for my life through this area, I had no time to stop and explore. There's NPCs in this area, items to collect, stories to uncover, and interesting places to explore, but I missed nearly all of it because there's just no reason to stop running. If you die, every single enemy respawns and you have to do it all over again, and it's just too overtuned to be realistically challenging or enjoyable. After finally making it through that frosty mess, we arrive at the boss guarding the next beacon, the Hollow Crow. A lot of people hated this fight, judging by the Reddit page, but it wasn't too bad in my eyes, and it was miles better than the Guardian King Ranger fight. Like the area before it, the boss itself has a huge amount of enemies to contend with, but the overall atmosphere and aesthetic of this fight was really enjoyable. It's just a shame that it was another gank squad. The Hollow Crow has a few mechanics. Around the area you'll see Lily, a mysterious humming spirit who floats around aimlessly. She's vulnerable to being attacked in the Umbral Realm or by soul flaying her, so you'll need to slowly chip away at the boss's health by attacking the spirit. As you do, the Crow will spawn periodic enemies, including bosses, zombies, dogs, and wombs of despair, which become really overwhelming, but if you keep running around you should be fine. When Lily takes enough punishment, the Crow wakes up from his slumber and starts pelting you with various icy attacks. The main one to watch out for is the icy winds, which slowly close in, so you'll need to make sure to stay on the inside of it or you'll die pretty much immediately. The Crow also fires icy projectiles from time to time, so spatial awareness is required to dodge all of that and the enemies at the same time. I ended up using another NPC summon for this fight, and that worked well to take away some of the aggro from various enemies, but then we faced the previous problem of NPC summons being hit by area of effect mechanics pretty much constantly, and that was another issue. This fight wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible, and it only took me 1 or 2 tries. Once the Crow has been vanquished, our reward is another beacon which we can cleanse. Lords of the Fallen starts off fairly slow, with the majority of the first half of the game leading up to the first beacon, but the beacons come pretty quickly in the second half. After completing that frosty fiasco, our next destination takes us to another nearby area, which we also conveniently have a key for. Do you remember the door in the bell tower right at the start of the game? Well, now we have a key for it in our inventory, and honestly I don't even remember picking it up. Behind the mysterious door is the Bellrise area, and this area is quite nice. It links back to Pilgrim's Perch, which is really good to see. As we walk around we can see snippets of the area we traversed at the start of the game, and enemies below us can even attack us here, which is quite annoying, but also pretty good level design. Here we also encounter a new use of the Umbral Parasite mechanic. Up until now we've seen enemies connected to parasites separately, but now you'll see enemies connected by cord to one another, meaning that you'll need to kill one enemy before you can kill the other one. This is a good use of combining mechanics to create more difficult and interesting gameplay, and the game does a good job of teaching us this new mechanic in an isolated environment, which is good and immersive tutorial design. I would have loved to see this enemy dropping an item or something as a reward for learning a new mechanic, and I think this was a small missed opportunity from the developers here. This area is fairly short, and my skill of running past enemies and dodging comes into play well here, but it's not nearly as bad as the snowy area. Another frustrating mechanic in this area is the enemies that throw barrels at you. This is a pain in the proverbial arse, because when navigating around corners in places that you've never been before, you'll almost certainly get hit by these barrels if you don't know what's coming, and they hit really hard. So a lot of the time when I took a barrel to the face, it was an instant death, which is not really enjoyable and just adds to the frustration. There's a whole other optional area here as well, which leads down into the Path of Devotion, which has another optional boss that we can fight, but for now we'll move on to the next main quest bot, the Sacred Resonance of Tenacity, or otherwise known as the Buckethead boss. Seriously, where did the developers come up with a name for these bosses? This boss is one of the easier bosses in the game. He has a few zombie adds to contend with, but because the arena is split into multiple rooms, it's easy to avoid them or kill them first before engaging the boss. There's also another Rumble Parasite you'll need to smash before you can damage the boss, so make sure you break this first. This guy only has a few basic holy attacks, and one AoE attack that he triggers by ringing this stupid bell on his head, so make sure to roll out the way of that one. Once this boss is toast, we move on to the Manse of the Hallowed Brothers, another area that I've got mixed feelings about. This is a theme you'll see in Lords of the Fallen in the later stages of the game. Lots of interesting and well designed areas being ruined in some way or another. The Manse of the Hallowed Brothers is effectively a big castle that we get to explore, and this area is actually really great. To progress, we have to weave in and out of the castle and its grounds, and the environmental design is really well done. This whole area is so much better and a breath of fresh air compared to the Fief of the Chill curse, because for the most part we get to methodically explore and clear enemies from the rooms one by one. Near the end of the area, the enemy density gets pretty hectic again, but for the most part, this area is difficult but fair, and harkens back to what I would expect from a normal Souls-like game. Less Devil May Cry and more Dark Souls. Eventually we make our way to the top of the castle, and in the background we can see our next beacon. Some more of that cool world building action. This whole section of the game is pretty complex in its level design, requiring you to weave in and out of rooms and up and down staircases, and even though this area itself is pretty small, the path through is quite long and there's only one vestige here. As you get to the top of the castle, there's a lot of enemies to contend with, including a Calrath Knight, some zombies, a Womb and a Grim Reaper, so I charged through all of this after painstakingly dying a few times. The problem here is that at the very top of the ramparts, you'll face another Sacred Resonance of Tenacity. Seriously, I can't say his name without cringing. This boss will immediately use his AoE attacks, which causes instant death every single time, and it's really hard to dodge it for some reason. So for the next 20 minutes, my game consisted of me running through this stupid gauntlet of enemies and then immediately getting barbecued by holy fire. It's really annoying and it feels like it was done on purpose, because this boss just does this AoE attack immediately every single time. Running through this area, I wish I had more time to stop and look around, because the scenery in the background here is absolutely wonderful. In the distance you can see huge monolithic zombies and giant celestial swords sticking out of the ground. After finally getting past that stupid gauntlet, we encounter yet another boss. The game really starts to throw bosses thick and fast at us here, and I'm okay with that. It's better than fighting hundreds of spectral archers and ruiners. While this guy is technically a boss, he's probably one of the easier ones. He has a bunch of melee attacks using his staff which are easily dodgeable, and a breath attack which covers the area in poison. This poison lingers for a really long time, so just wail on the boss and kill him before you die to poison, or just use a poison cure. And it's as easy as that. And yeah, of course, this guy becomes a normal enemy from now on as well, which is brilliant. After that we enter the Tower of Penance. I'm a bit conflicted on this area. On the one hand, I fucking hate it. On the other hand, it's actually pretty awesome. Imagine a tower that you need to fight your way through and then turn it upside down. The goal of this area is to get to the top of the tower, which then allows us to get to the bottom of the tower. I know it's confusing, but bear with me. The door to the front of the tower is locked, so we need to ascend to the top and then descend to unlock it, which is quite interesting and unique level design. Thankfully there's a handy elevator nearby which takes us up, but like every other elevator in the game, it doesn't come back down again when you die. So you'll need to wait for it to come down and then get in it and wait for it to go back up again. And this is really boring having to do this every single time. There's even a lever here right at the top, but the only thing this lever does is pull the elevator up to you if you need to go down. But you can't use it to send it down to save time later. Inside the tower is where things start to get annoying. The goal is to descend each layer bit by bit, avoiding both ranged attacks and melee attacks while contending with awful platforming to safely make it back down. And this is such a cool idea, but in practice it becomes really frustrating due to the bad platforming mechanics and really annoying ranged enemies. The developers have also kindly put some explosive traps on the walls, which knock you off if you aren't paying attention, because if we aren't frustrated, we're doing it wrong. Finally, we make it to the bottom, or should I say the middle of the tower, and we open the door. Now we have a shortcut right next to the bonfire, so this part will be easy, right? Well, not quite. We continue to descend even further, and I really want to like this level design, because each layer is like a little puzzle, trying to find the next ladder or safe jump to make it down. But while you're trying to figure this out, you'll be bombarded by bucket heads, boss enemies and ranged attackers, which makes it really difficult to stop and think things through. By this point I'm really good at sprinting in circles while my brain tries to figure out my next move, and it almost feels like this is an intended mechanic at this point. Finally, near the bottom we find a lever which clears a blockage from the next hole, and allows us to jump down, and this is where I encounter another problem with stupid platforming mechanics. These tiny little holes in the floor allow you to fall down them, which is fine, but if you roll over them or walk over them at the slightly wrong angle, you'll just hover over the top and be squished by another Sancho Knight, which is really frustrating. After enduring more platforming based torture, which is kind of fitting considering this entire area is filled with torture cages, we eventually make it to the bottom and are faced with the next boss, Tancred, Master of Castigations. Overall this fight is pretty good. It's not too difficult when you've mastered the mechanics, and it's a two-phase fight, so once the boss has been killed once, he transforms into a much more formidable and disgusting looking foe. In phase 1 you'll be fighting the humanoid boss, and he's pretty easy. You've just got to watch out for his holy AoE attacks, which are telegraphed by the boss's glowing shield. Phase 2 is when shit starts flying.
Pain. Not so satisfying when you're on the receiving end. Now you will know darkness, brother.
The boss transforms into a horrendous amalgamation with 4 limbs. On paper, this fight is really cool and has a number of interesting attacks, but I came across a few issues. First off, if you summon an NPC to help and by some miracle they survive phase 1, they seemingly just bug out in phase 2 and never attack where the boss is. I tried this numerous times with different NPCs, and each time they bugged out and just spin around in circles like a blind Roomba. Also, due to the boss's awkward lock-on spots, the camera likes to freak out. The boss has 4 lock-on points, one on each of his limbs, but because you can't lock onto his head, the camera struggles to keep up when the boss does its erratic attack patterns, so be prepared for some awkward motion sickness. The only things really to watch out for here are the fire attacks. In his second phase, the boss shoots fireballs at you from time to time, and if you're lucky, he'll spew lava on the floor, which lasts slightly longer than the animation suggests, so watch out for that. Eventually, after a good amount of tries, I managed to beat him, but it was a close and difficult fight, and my arse cheeks were firmly clenched. We use the nearby elevator to access the top of the tower and cleanse the next beacon, and we go back to where we came from earlier. From here we go right and enter the Abbey of the Hallowed Sisters, which now we have a key for. This area is pretty tough and has enemies coming at you from all directions, but at least the environment looks nice. Early on we encounter this tunnel of death which is flooded by zombies and has firebombs on the walls, and it almost feels like the game is encouraging me to run through this because who in their right mind would stop and fight here? We encounter another mage boss, and this boss spits out blood patches on the floor to heal herself and fires ranged beams from her eyeballs like Optimus Prime. The strategy for this one is just to kill her as fast as possible and to hope she doesn't heal. Honestly, this boss can barely be called a boss. And yeah, I did die more than once. The level design in this area is fairly complex, as with most areas up to this point, but the Abbey has a few tricks up its sleeve, with more boss mages stationed on high vantage points, and she can hit you from a really long range if you're not careful. Also, if you're lucky, the beam glitches out. And speaking of bugs, for some reason all the shadows glitch out in this area from time to time as well, which is really weird. I tried to stop and admire it, but I got double teamed by a buckethead and an archer at the same time. So note to self, don't stop and look at the shadows. As we continue through the Abbey, I end up just running through most of this because again, it's pretty much a nightmare. We encounter a courtyard with nothing useful in it at all, and I get ganked so hard that I can't even leave because the enemies are blocking the passage. Seriously, a mage, 3 dogs, and a pyramid head? Like what incentive do I have to stop and fight here? Well, joke's on me because we get killed by a mimic anyway.
Eat your vegetables!
After some more Lords of the Fallen Ridge Racer, we come to a nice looking area. The statue in the middle of the courtyard actually warps into a horrifying looking umbral entity, and it's nice to see that the developers have kept up the use of the umbral mechanic going into the later stages of the game. It's little touches like this that show that the developers really do care about the product that they're making. To get inside the castle, the door's locked, so we have to navigate up the steps of a half-destroyed tower, which is still standing in the umbral realm. This might be one of the biggest structures we've actually been able to explore that only exists in the Umbral Realm, and I thought this was pretty cool. Eventually we make it to Judge Cleric, the Radiant Sentinel, and I think this might be one of my favourite bosses in the game, just because of the awesome aesthetics and music. When entering this area, the dark, rainy atmosphere transforms into a picturesque meadow scene at dawn. This sudden shift in atmosphere is an undeniably cool contrast to the area we were once in, and we get to jump down and slam ourselves into the fight as well, which is badass. This boss isn't too bad. It's a relatively fair fight. You have to watch out for some of the combos which go on for longer than you'd expect, and every now and then she'll summon some AoE swords which you need to get out of the way of, similar to Pieta. This fight reminds me of an epic ending boss fight. Do you remember that scene with the boss at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3? Well, this is the Soulslike equivalent of that. Well, that wasn't too bad. Oh, there's more. Okay, I lied. This is my least favourite boss. Judge Cleric actually has two phases. Phase 1 being Happy Judge, and Phase 2 being Angry Dark Fire Judge. This boss wouldn't be that difficult if it didn't compose of two pretty long separate boss phases, and the second phase is arguably harder than the first, so it's difficult to learn all of the mechanics without wasting a lot of time. Phase 2 adds a hefty dose of challenge into the mix, thanks to the heavy hitting fire attacks. She'll spawn fiery hazards which you need to avoid, and a jumping attack which explodes in a short radius around you, so try not to run away after this or you'll get hit again. Lastly, she has a really wide AoE attack, which causes a wave of fire to move outwards, so you'll have to dodge it. But this time, unlike other similar previous mechanics, the wave comes back again, so you'll need to make sure to dodge it twice. Trying to angle the camera to see what's happening behind me, while also keeping an eye on the boss, was pretty tricky. Eventually I managed to get this fight down, and with a stroke of luck, multiplayer worked as well. So, with the help of my summoned friend Dante, we beat it together. Props to this guy though, because I think I must have spent a good hour and a half and about 10 tries trying to kill this boss, and he stuck with me through the whole thing, so high five Dante. After the boss is dead, we get another opportunity to cleanse another beacon, and that's this area done and dusted. From here I got a bit stuck and I didn't really know where to go. If you use your brain, unlike me, you'll be able to figure out that the next beacon actually points back to Upper Calrath. But when going through this area, the door is now blocked by an umbral blockage, so we need to remove that first. After a bit of wandering, eventually I managed to figure out that we need to go back around to Upper Calrath in the opposite direction, using the shortcut that we found earlier. And I quite like this, the use of old areas combining together to create new gameplay experiences, but at the same time, it's pretty tricky if you don't know where to go. While we make our way back through Upper Calrath, we get to the arena from earlier, which had the Ruiner and the dogs, which we ran away from. But now when we enter, we get ambushed by the Lightbearer. Remember this guy? He's been chasing us throughout the whole game at this point, and this marks our third encounter. But this time you have to beat him, and he'll be here until you do. When you first fight this guy, you'll notice he has an umbral parasite connected to him, preventing him from being damaged. But this parasite is actually connected to the boss outside of the boss room, and there's no way of dealing with it once you've started the fight, which is not really great design. You effectively have to die the first time around unless you know exactly what to expect. So we pop the parasite by ascending the walls nearby and soulflay the statue, and now we can kill the boss. The Lightbearer himself is actually a pushover when you fight him this late on in the game. His dragon will fly around and breathe lava at you, and then he'll jump down and fight you one-on-one. He's really easy and has some basic mechanics, but for some reason for me he bugged out when I fought him, and just decided to pay no attention to me whatsoever. So take that, game. You want to play dirty with me and I'll do it back, no regrets. Once the Lightbearer has been dealt with, we're free to clear the path in Upper Calrath, and we encounter another short boss fight against the Iron Wayfarer. I'm guessing he's finally gone completely rogue. This fight is easy. It's a simple one-on-one and the boss has a really predictable combo attack. The only problem with this fight is that the arena is absolutely tiny. Seriously, I don't know who decided it was a good idea to put this fight in such a small arena. Fighting the Ruiner on a small bridge early on was fun, and I commended the game for having a tight, long space to run around in. But here, it's so cramped, and the main difficulty of the fight was actually just trying to see without the camera bugging out. Finally, with the Iron Wayfarer killed, we're free to enter the final area of the game. And my god, if you thought FIFA the Chill Curse was bad, well, welcome to hell. This area literally looks like Mount Doom in hell. This area is enormous and spans the castle grounds and into the castle depths itself. This area is the Mario Kart equivalent of Rainbow Road because there's just so many enemies here that you'll never kill them all. Just zoom your way through as fast as possible and just don't look back. It gets so bad here, like there are times when you need to soulflay statues to break umbral blockages to progress, which is fine. But because there are literally so many enemies, I can't even lock on to the statue without getting stuck targeting the things around them. And I know I could methodically slowly make my way through this area, but it's just ridiculous. I actively dislike this area as much as the Frost area from earlier. It's just not fun in the slightest. Inside the castle itself, we encounter another mini mechanic. You see these sage enemies? Well, whenever you see these moving forward, make sure to kill them because when you do, you'll smash the nearby red crystals, which are often required to progress. This is never an explicitly explained mechanic, but this area is not passable until you first figure it out. So it's not too bad, and the developers teach you this mechanic in an immersive way. Inside the castle, we fight two ruiners at once, or should I say run away from two ruiners at once. We find another sage, we smash another crystal, and then we pull a lever. This lever turns the staircase behind us just like Hogwarts, which is cool and allows us to progress. Although this area took me well over 2 hours to get through just because of the intricate level design, and all of the levers and the crystals and the overwhelming enemy counts, which make it really hard to work out where you need to go while fending off 5 enemies at once. And finally, we descend into the bowels of hell and come face to face with the penultimate boss. In my opinion, this is the final boss fight of the game, and it begins with a sad sight. You'll find the boss hunched over in the corner like he's been told off, and you'll get a few free hits in on him. Once he's taken about 10% damage, he'll wake up and equip a massive head as his weapon. I really wish we could get this weapon for ourselves. This boss is massive and he moves really quickly, so trying to close in on him becomes a bit of a pain in the arse. He also looks a bit like a decrepit Gimli from Lord of the Rings. I don't know why I've referenced Lord of the Rings so much in this video, but this game really brings it out in me. The Sundred Monarch has a few ranged attacks and some quick melee attacks you'll swap between while jumping around. At 50% health, you'll start to use some fire attacks, including an AoE which you can roll through, and some really quick knife throws, similar to the holy attacks we saw from Judge Cleric. He also does a really cool attack which summons circles of flaming knives in various layers, so watch out for that one. Overall, this boss isn't anything special, but it took me a good few tries to beat him, mainly because he's got so much health. Once the Sundred Monarch has been sundered again, we continue onward to the final fight. If you're going for the Radiant ending, that is. And before we leave, we get another boss memory, which is hilariously large, which makes sense considering the size of the poor boss we just fought. Adyr marks the final fight of the Radiant ending, and you only need to fight him if you're going for this ending. The boss area for this fight is actually really cool, and shows the hulking boss in the middle of the arena, surrounded by various ruins and skeletons, and the atmosphere here is really cool. It reminds me a lot of Kitava from Path of Exile. You'll be required to navigate the boss arena while killing fiery zombies which explode and deal significant range damage if you're not paying attention. They'll also leave nice lava pools on the floor, so if you've got ranged weapons it's worth using them here. Some enemies are also protected by umbral parasites, so pop them before dealing with the enemies head on. This boss fight, however, just felt like an attempt to annoy me, because if you're playing mostly a melee build like I was, it becomes a real test of patience. There's no real mechanics or difficult design in this fight, you just wander around the arena and hope that you can kill enough enemies before you take too much damage. After a really long test of patience, stamina and endurance, we finally kill enough of the zombies and the boss keels over, broken for good. And this is an unusual boss fight to end the game with. Even though there are interesting story moments layered into it via voice lines, you don't actually fight the final boss. You just kill an assortment of really weak adds until the boss finally dies, and this left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. There isn't any real victory here. This just feels like a first stage to an epic encounter which never happened. Depending on your choices in Lords of the Fallen, namely whether or not you decided to cleanse the beacons, you'll encounter 3 different endings. The Radiant ending, which we achieved here, the Umbral ending, and the Inferno ending. The Radiant ending requires you to cleanse the 5 beacons and kill Adyr at the end. The Inferno ending requires you to not cleanse any beacons and do some specific things along the way. This ending culminates in the avoidance of having to kill Adyr at the very end. The Umbral ending is more specific and requires you to not cleanse any beacons at all, and requires you to complete a number of specific NPC related objectives. This is probably the most complicated ending to achieve, and you'll most likely need the help of a guide, just so you can get through it without having to restart a million times. In our ending, Adyr gives up and goes back to wherever he came from, and we get the option to move over into New Game Plus. Overall, Lords of the Fallen is a mixed bag of experiences. On the one hand, the gameplay itself is solid and offers the player a variety of ways to play. For example, you've got spellcasting, ranged combat, and a multitude of melee styles, and the combat is very satisfying and true to a Souls-like form. The level design, sound, ambience, look and feel of the game are all outstanding accomplishments, and this is probably one of the best looking Souls-like games on the market. Though the game has some extremely frustrating enemy design, lack of enemy variety and overwhelming difficulty in some aspects, mainly due to the enemy density rather than actual mechanical depth. The game also suffers from various visual and mechanical bugs, especially when fighting bosses, and the game could use a tune-up in terms of its NPC summon design, especially when contending with AoE attacks in boss fights. My opinion on the boss fights is also fairly mixed. There are some bosses with incredible atmosphere and really enjoyable mechanics like Pieta, the Hushed Saint, the Spurn Progeny and Judge Cleric, but the rest of the bosses are fairly forgettable, and some even downright frustrating. I'm looking at you, Guardian Folard. Overall, Lords of the Fallen took me about 50 hours to complete, and I enjoyed the majority of my time with the game, but I'm pretty confident that I don't want to go back and play the game again for the foreseeable future, and I'm certainly not touching New Game Plus anytime soon. So I hope you enjoyed this look into Lords of the Fallen. I'd love to know what you guys thought of the game, so leave me a comment below letting me know if you thought it was good or bad. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a comment and subscribe for more content like this in the future. And as always, happy soul flaying.